On a cul-de-sac outside Columbus, Ohio, 14 houses face the street. Not one has a front porch. What they have are garages, two-car, jutting forward, closer to the sidewalk than the front door itself. Nobody is outside. Nobody has been outside in the 2 full hours a drone shot would need to quietly prove that point. Now cut to Utrecht, in the Netherlands, on a residential block barely wider than that cul-de-sac's driveway. People sit outside on raised stoops. A woman leans on a second-floor balcony rail, talking to a neighbor loading groceries below. Here's the part that should stop you. Most American homes built before 1930 had a front porch too. This isn't an absence, it's a reversal. Somewhere behind a glassed-in porch, now used to store a lawnmower, something official changed how American houses were allowed to face the street. What was it, and who decided? Walk through any American city built before the Great Depression, and the porch is everywhere. Sears, Roebuck & Company sold entire porch kits by mail-order catalog, pre-cut and numbered for assembly. Millwork factories in Cincinnati and Grand Rapids mass-produced turned columns, spindled railings, and gingerbread trim, cheaply enough that a modest bungalow in Tampa or a craftsman cottage in Sacramento could carry the same wraparound porch once reserved for wealthy Victorian estates. By 1910, the porch wasn't a luxury feature. It was the default American front elevation, present on bungalows, four squares, and shotgun houses alike, from Seattle to Savannah. Some homes even built sleeping porches upstairs, screened rooms where families lay out on hot nights before mechanical cooling existed. Pattern books like Radford's Artistic Bungalows and Sears' Honor-Built catalog didn't just offer a porch as an option. In most of their standard floor plans, it wasn't optional at all. It was assumed, the way a front door or a chimney was assumed, because a house without one would have looked unfinished to a buyer in 1915. Then, within about 3 decades, all of it stopped. Housing historians tracking construction patterns through the mid-20th century describe front porches as having all but disappeared from new home construction by the 1960s. Not shrunk, not modified, disappeared from blueprints, from builder catalogs, from the American housing supply chain almost entirely, in cities that had nothing else in common except that they were building fast. That is not a gradual style drift. That is a construction default flipping in one generation, on a national scale, all at once. And here's the part everyone skips past too quickly. Everyone blames the car and the air conditioner. That explains why people stopped using porches. It doesn't explain why builders stopped building them. The standard explanation goes like this. Cars filled the streets with noise and exhaust, so sitting on the porch stopped being pleasant. Air conditioning made the indoors more comfortable than the shaded outdoors ever could be. Television gave families a reason to gather in the living room instead of on the front step, watching a screen instead of watching the street. All 3 of these are true. All 3 genuinely happened in that order across the middle of the 20th century. But look closely at what those explanations actually claim. That millions of individual homeowners, independently, in different states, in different climates, in different income brackets, all made the same private comfort decision at almost exactly the same time, and that this private preference then reshaped the physical blueprint of the American house nationwide, before a single one of them had even moved in. That is not how mass construction works. A homeowner doesn't design a floor plan, a builder does. And a builder doesn't build what he personally wants, he builds what a bank will lend against, because an unfinanceable house is an unsellable house. Look at a post-war subdivision lot from above, and the evidence is staring back at you. The garage sits forward, the driveway dominates the front yard. The house is angled toward the street only enough to fit a mailbox and a single narrow entry walk. That's not a taste, that's a template, repeated on thousands of lots with almost no variation. Someone had to approve that template before a bank would ever put money behind it, long before the first family ever ran their air conditioner. Registered automobiles in the United States climbed from roughly 8 million in 1920 to more than 27 million by 1940. That growth is real, and it changed how streets felt. But a rising car count explains why porches got noisier and less pleasant to sit on. It does not explain why the porch itself stopped appearing in the blueprint before the first car ever drove past the finished lot. The person who spent his career explaining exactly what that template destroyed was a sociologist named Ray Oldenburg. In his 1989 book, The Great Good Place, Oldenburg coined a term that has since become standard vocabulary in urban planning circles: the third place. Informal, low-stakes public gathering spots that are neither home nor work, where casual social contact happens without an appointment and without an agenda. The front porch was one of America's original third places. So was the corner store. So was the barber shop, the stoop, the shaded bench outside a neighborhood tavern. Oldenburg's research argued that as post-war suburban design stripped these spaces out of the built environment, it didn't just remove architecture. It removed the daily, low-effort social contact that had quietly held neighborhoods together for a century. Around the same period, urban critic Jane Jacobs was writing about what she called eyes on the street, the informal surveillance and familiarity that porches, stoops, and street-facing windows provide simply by existing, letting a parent watch 3 houses worth of kids at once without ever leaving home. Strip that away, replace it with a windowless garage door facing the sidewalk, and a neighbor now has nothing to look at and no one to wave to. Oldenburg wasn't describing a cosmetic loss, and neither was Jacobs. They were documenting a functioning piece of everyday civic infrastructure, quietly deleted from the blueprint without a single public debate about whether it should be. But Oldenburg was diagnosing a symptom. His research explains, in painful detail, exactly what was lost. It doesn't name who took it. Here is who took it. In 1934, Congress created the Federal Housing Administration under the National Housing Act, giving the agency the power to insure private mortgages against default. That single power reshaped American housing more thoroughly than any style trend ever could, because it meant builders who wanted their homes financeable had to design to FHA specifications, not to buyer taste, not to regional tradition, but to a federal underwriting manual few homebuyers ever read. The FHA's earliest property standards, first codified as Circular 2 in the 1930s and steadily expanded through its post-war minimum property requirements, focused heavily on what the agency itself called neighborhood design and planning as a direct condition of insurability, prioritizing uniform, efficient, car-accessible layouts over the mixed, porch-fronted streetscapes that had defined pre-war American cities. Builders like William Levitt, whose Levittown developments became the template for post-war mass suburbia, built explicitly to FHA and VA standards, because that compliance was what unlocked financing for tens of thousands of buyers at once. Layered on top of that federal mechanism was a second, older one: zoning. In 1926, the Supreme Court's decision in Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty Company upheld a municipality's right to dictate land use and lot layout, the ruling that gave American cities the legal foundation for what's now called Euclidean zoning, separating uses and standardizing car-oriented residential lots, block by block. Together, FHA underwriting and Euclidean setback and garage placement rules did something no individual homeowner's air conditioner ever could. They made the car-forward, backyard-facing house the only version a builder could insure, finance, and legally build at scale in every region of the country simultaneously. This is not a story about changing taste. It's a story about a financing requirement that quietly became the only house America was allowed to build, and the developers who complied were rewarded with the largest home building boom in the country's history. Levittown, New York, built more than 17,000 nearly identical houses between 1947 and 1951, each one designed from the outset to clear FHA and VA underwriting without modification, because a single rejected floor plan meant thousands of unsellable units instead of one. That is the actual mechanism. Not a homeowner deciding porches were unfashionable, a federal underwriter's checklist deciding, for every builder chasing that volume, what could and could not go on the front of a house. If this had been a one-time policy quirk, it would have faded within a decade. It didn't, because the system built to enforce it kept getting maintained, refined, and re-standardized for a quarter century. FHA field offices across the country initially issued their own regional versions of the minimum property requirements, a southern edition covering Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, Mississippi, and Tennessee. Other multi-state editions covering the Midwest, the Northeast, and the Pacific states, each dictating its own version of acceptable lot layout, setback, and street-facing design. By 1951, there were 51 separate regional editions in active use across the country. That is not oversight. That is an entire federal bureaucracy actively administering house form rules, insuring office by insuring office, for millions of new homes. By 1956, FHA had consolidated those 51 editions down to 21, not because the underlying standards were being loosened, but because the agency wanted more consistent enforcement and fewer inconsistencies for builders to exploit between neighboring states. That consolidation process ran for years, revised edition after edition into the late 1950s, precisely during the 2 decades when post-war subdivisions were being built at the fastest rate in American history, with millions of new units financed through FHA and VA-backed mortgages. Every one of those editions kept the same underlying incentive structure fully intact: build to the federally approved template, or risk a home a bank simply would not insure. Local zoning boards, meanwhile, layered their own front yard setback ordinances, minimum lot width requirements, and garage placement rules on top of the federal standard, independently reinforcing the identical car-forward form without ever having to coordinate with Washington to do it. This wasn't a single bad decision made once in 1934 and then quietly forgotten. It was actively reapproved, republished, and reinforced for 25 straight years, while an entire generation of American builders complied, because compliance, not conviction, was the only way to get paid. Between 1945 and 1960, the United States built roughly 15 million new housing units, a construction pace the country had never seen before and has rarely matched since. Almost all of it moved through the same FHA and VA underwriting pipeline, which meant almost all of it inherited the same car-forward, porchless template by default, whether a given builder in Ohio ever coordinated with a builder in California or not. They didn't need to coordinate. They were reading from the same manual. The first real challenge to that template didn't come from Washington. It came from a stretch of beach on the Florida Panhandle. In 1981, developer Robert Davis began building Seaside, Florida, on 80 acres of land his grandfather had bought in 1946, and that Davis had inherited in 1978. He hired architects Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zeberk to design it, and together they wrote what's considered one of the first form-based zoning codes of the modern era, a document deliberately structured to reverse what FHA, underwriting, and Euclidean zoning had done for 50 years. Seaside's urban code mandated that houses face the street. It mandated front porches, subject to design review, alongside picket fences and shallow setbacks, specifically to rebuild the porch-fronted social fabric the post-war template had erased from American town planning. It worked, visually and architecturally, almost immediately. Seaside became a case study taught in planning schools worldwide, helped launch the Congress for the New Urbanism in 1993, and eventually earned a spot on the National Register of Historic Places in 2010. But here is the twist the town's own architectural historians have quietly acknowledged. Many of Seaside's mandated porches sit empty. The region's brutal Gulf Coast heat and humidity still drive residents indoors to air conditioning, exactly as they did everywhere else in the country. And Seaside, by its own scholars' account, is overwhelmingly a vacation resort. Most of its roughly 423 residential units are owned by part-time or seasonal residents, not full-time neighbors who would actually build the daily, repeated porch-based relationships Oldenburg spent his career describing. The code brought the architecture back. It legislated the exact silhouette that had vanished from American blueprints for 50 years. It didn't bring the community back with it. The fix solved the visible layer of the problem and quietly exposed the one still sitting underneath it. So look again at that cul-de-sac outside Columbus, and at that empty, glassed-in porch now used for storing a lawnmower. It isn't evidence of a family that simply preferred air conditioning to fresh air. It's the physical residue of a financing requirement written into federal policy in 1934, reinforced by a Supreme Court ruling from 1926, administered edition after edition through the 1950s, and never fully undone, even by the very reformers who spent their careers trying. The Utrecht Street, the Italian balcony, the Southern European courtyard. Those survived not because Europeans valued their neighbors more than Americans did, but because their cities were never replatted around a mortgage manual that required a garage to face the road before a bank would sign off on the loan. Seaside proved you could legislate the porch back onto a house. It could not legislate a neighbor back onto that porch, because the deeper machinery underneath it, the car dependency, the air-conditioned interior life, the federally standardized suburban lot, was never repealed. It was simply decorated over, one form-based code at a time, in developments most Americans will never be able to afford to live in. The American front porch didn't vanish because people stopped liking their neighbors. It vanished because, for one crucial mid-century stretch, no federally insurable house was allowed to be built for them. That's the real answer to the question you clicked for. Not taste, not comfort. A requirement, quietly written in 1934, quietly enforced for 25 years, and still shaping, right now, whether the house going up on your street has anywhere left to sit, and anyone left outside to wave to.